On Thanksgiving night, in front of 40 people who feared her husband's name, Serena Ashcroft said the quietest word of her life. Not a scream, not a threat, just, okay. The room thought she was broken. She was already gone. What Dante Vescari didn't know was that his wife had spent 8 months building a bomb made entirely of truth. And on that night, she lit the fuse. This is the story of a woman who walked out of a dynasty and burned it down on her way out the door. Watch until the end. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The turkey had been resting on the sideboard for 20 minutes, and no one had touched it yet because no one sat down until Dante Vescari sat down. That was the rule. Not a written rule, not anything anyone had ever said out loud, but a rule as fixed and immovable as the marble floors of the Vescari estate, a rule that lived in the tightening of shoulders and the careful way eyes moved around the room whenever Dante was present. Serena knew the rule. She had been following it for 6 years. She stood near the far end of the kitchen, one hand resting on the edge of the counter, watching the catering staff move in practiced silence through the space she was technically mistress of. Technically. The Vescari estate had a head chef, a household manager, 2 personal assistants, and a woman named Cora who had run this kitchen for 11 years before Serena ever set foot in it. Serena had learned early that her role here was decorative. She looked the part. She spoke when spoken to. She did not ask questions about the finances. She had been asking questions about the finances for the past 8 months. Noah was upstairs with his babysitter. 4 years old, already serious-faced, already watching everything in the careful way children develop when they grow up in houses where tension moves through the air like weather. Serena had kissed him goodnight before coming down for dinner, had held his small, warm weight against her chest for a beat longer than usual, and he had patted her twice on the back with his open hand, an old gesture, something she used to do to comfort him, already reversed, already coming back to her from her 4-year-old son, who somehow understood that she needed it. She breathed through her nose and went to find her seat. The dining room held 40 people on Thanksgiving, extended family, business associates, the 2 federal judges Dante kept on retainer for reasons he had never explained, and Serena had stopped asking about 3 years ago. Valentina Vescari held court at the far end of the table, dressed in charcoal silk, her silver hair pinned at the nape of her neck with a precision that looked effortless and took, Serena knew, approximately 90 minutes. Dante's mother was 63 years old and had never in her life allowed a single thing to look like it cost her anything. Dante was already seated when Serena came in. He looked up from his phone, didn't smile, looked back down. Across the table, his sister Margot gave Serena a brief sympathetic glance that meant nothing and never had. Serena took her chair, shook out her napkin, and placed it across her lap with the same controlled stillness she had been cultivating for 6 years. Her hands were steady. She was proud of how steady her hands were. The meal moved the way Thanksgiving always moved in this house. Slowly, loudly, the conversation shifting between Italian and English in a way that had initially charmed Serena and now felt like being talked around in 2 languages simultaneously. Alessio Vescari, Dante's father, sat at the head of the table and said very little. He was 71, a retired patriarch with the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent decades making decisions that didn't require his body to do any heavy lifting. His eyes moved constantly. He laughed at appropriate moments. He never looked directly at Serena. She had noticed that. She had been noticing a lot of things. The trouble started over dessert. It always started over dessert. There was something about the release of the main course, the wine already settled in everyone's blood, the children sent off to the other room, that seemed to open a door in every Vescari gathering for the knife-sharp comments that everyone pretended weren't knife-sharp. Tonight it was Valentina who started, which was not surprising because it was always Valentina who started. Serena. Not a question. A summons. Serena looked up from her untouched slice of pumpkin pie. Yes. Dante tells me you've been asking the accountants about the offshore accounts. Valentina said it the way she said everything, pleasantly, warmly, with a warmth that contained within it a very clear edge. Around the table, conversations dimmed. Not all at once, but they dimmed. The Cayman accounts specifically. Serena set her fork down. The sound of it against the china plate was very small and very audible in the newly quiet room. I was reviewing the quarterly statements. There were some discrepancies I wanted to understand. Discrepancies, Valentina smiled. She was reviewing the quarterly statements. She said it to the table, not to Serena, which was the particular flavor of cruelty Valentina preferred, making her invisible while discussing her. Dante, your wife was reviewing the quarterly statements. Dante turned to look at Serena. His face gave nothing away. It never gave anything away. That was one of the first things she had found compelling about him, years ago. The stillness, the control, the sense that somewhere behind his eyes ran an engine you couldn't access. She had spent 6 years trying to access that engine. Now she understood that trying to access it had been her first mistake. Those accounts are not your concern, Dante said. His voice was quiet. His voice was always quiet. Quiet was how he communicated that a line had been crossed. I'm your wife. I have signatory authority on 3 of those accounts. The terms of the accounts, Serena, his voice dropped further. That was the second register. One more drop and they would be in territory she recognized from 2 nights ago, from 6 months ago, from the first year of their marriage when she had still believed that if she could just explain herself clearly enough, he would listen. We have guests. I know we have guests. Then we can discuss this later. You said that last week. She heard herself say it. She had not planned to say it. Around the table, no one was pretending to have a separate conversation anymore. 40 people, sirs. Powerful people, careful people, people who understood exactly what kind of household they were sitting in, were watching with the particular stillness of an audience that knows they are witnessing something that will be discussed for a long time afterward. Valentina's voice cut through the silence with surgical cheerfulness. I think what Dante is asking, Serena, is for a simple apology to the family for causing this disruption. That's all. A very simple thing. And there it was. The ask. The ask that was not really an ask. The ask that was a demonstration, a performance of control, a reminder to the room and to Serena of exactly where she stood in this architecture. Apologize. Smooth it over. Sit down. Be quiet. Be the beautiful decoration that didn't read financial documents or ask questions about Cayman accounts or notice that $3 million had moved through a shell company in Luxembourg in a way that didn't match any legitimate business purpose she could identify. 40 people watching. Valentina waiting, pleasantly, with that smile. Dante looking at her with the quiet engine running behind his eyes. And Noah upstairs, 4 years old, patting her back with his open hand because he could already read the weather in a house like this. Serena took a breath. She picked up her napkin from her lap and set it on the table beside her plate very neatly. She said, okay, 1 word. Flat. Uninflected. Not apologetic and not defiant and not anything Valentina had been expecting, because what Valentina had been expecting was either a tearful apology or an outburst, either of which would have been satisfying in different ways. And what she got instead was a single syllable that contained nothing she could use. Around the table, the assembled family and associates interpreted this as submission. Valentina's smile broadened slightly. Margot looked relieved. 2 of the business associates returned to their desserts. Dante held Serena's gaze for 1 more moment and then looked away, which was itself a dismissal, a closing of a door. Serena folded her hands in her lap. She finished the glass of water in front of her. She waited until the conversation restarted and the attention moved elsewhere, which took approximately 90 seconds. Then she excused herself quietly to check on Noah. She did not come back. She had been planning this for 11 days. That was the precise window. 11 days since the moment she had understood that the discrepancies were not accountant errors, were not aggressive but legal tax strategy, were not any of the things she had spent months constructing as alternate explanations because the real explanation was something her mind had been refusing to fully accept. The real explanation was that Dante Viscari had been running the family empire into the ground for years, had hidden it behind a facade of legitimate business, so polished and so complete that even his own mother didn't know, and that somewhere in the architecture of the collapse was the signature of Alessio Viscari, the patriarch, the legend, the man who had sat at the head of that table tonight with his moving eyes and his careful laugh, who had pushed his son into it. She had not panicked when she understood this. That surprised her, afterward, the absence of panic. What she had felt instead was a cold, clarifying stillness, not unlike the feeling of stepping outside in deep winter and having the air shock your lungs into total alertness. She had sat in front of her laptop in the small study off the master bedroom at 2 in the morning with 3 financial databases open and a glass of water she had forgotten to drink, and she had thought, I need 11 days. The go bag had been packed for 8. Not a bag. 2 suitcases, sized for a long trip, containing Noah's things and hers. Practical things. Nothing sentimental except one photograph of her mother that she had folded small and put in the interior pocket of her handbag. She had moved them incrementally, a few items at a time over 3 weeks, to a storage unit she had rented under her maiden name. The driver she had arranged was a man named Pele, not his real name, a nickname she had never questioned, who ran private transfers for the international business crowd and who had once driven her to a legal meeting she hadn't told Dante about, and who had established himself in that single interaction as a man who understood discretion the way other people understood gravity. She had called him from a burner phone. She had given him a departure window. He had said, I'll be there. The attorney was a woman named Claudette Marsh, 61 years old, a former federal prosecutor with a practice that specialized in financial crime and a reputation that made the kind of lawyers Dante used nervous in the way that powerful people get nervous when they encounter power they can't buy. Serena had found her through the kind of careful, lateral research that didn't leave searchable tracks. A recommendation from a woman she'd met at a financial compliance conference 14 months ago, before any of this had fully crystallized, when she had still been in the phase of noticing things without fully admitting what she was noticing. Serena had met with Claudette Marsh 3 times, always in person, never by phone. She had brought the documents in physical form and watched Claudette read through them with the focused stillness of someone who had spent 40 years reading documents like these. At the 3rd meeting, Claudette had looked up from the files and said, without drama, "This is sufficient." And then, "When you leave, make sure you're not in the country." Serena had nodded. She had already bought the tickets. The package she had built over 8 months, the recordings, the financial records, the documented transaction chains, the expert analyses she had quietly commissioned, was encrypted and distributed across 3 separate secure servers, with access credentials held by Claudette, by Serena's younger sister in Vancouver, and by a journalist at a financial crimes publication whose name Serena had never spoken out loud to anyone. The package was timed. If Serena didn't enter a specific reset code every 72 hours, the package would release automatically to all 3 holders simultaneously. It was not a dramatic mechanism. It was an insurance policy. It was also, she recognized, the kind of thing that meant there was no going back. You didn't build an insurance policy like this if you were leaving a bad marriage. You built it if you were leaving an empire and you needed to be very sure the empire understood that following you would cost more than letting you go. She understood that this was the hinge. Once she walked out of that house tonight, the world she had lived in for 6 years would begin to dismantle itself. She walked upstairs and opened the door to Noah's room. He was asleep. His babysitter, a college girl named Tess, who had worked for the family for 2 years and who Serena had quietly, carefully made sure was not in the house tonight. Tess had a night off. Serena had arranged it 10 days ago, except that Tess's replacement, a woman she trusted, was sitting in the armchair by the window with a paperback. "Is he ready?" Serena asked, keeping her voice low. The woman, her name was Diane. She was 44. She was the sister of Serena's closest friend from before the marriage. She had driven 4 hours for this and asked no questions. Nodded once. "Bags are in my car. I parked on the service road." "Good." Serena crossed to Noah's bed and crouched beside it. He stirred slightly, made a small sound. She put her hand on his back, that steady pressure. "Baby, we're going on a trip." He opened his eyes without panic. He was her son. He had learned in 4 years to wait calmly in uncertain circumstances. That fact pressed against the inside of her chest like a bruise she had been carrying for a long time. "Now?" he said. "Now." He sat up. He reached for his stuffed rabbit, a battered thing, gray where it had once been white, one eye replaced twice. She picked it up for him and held it out, and he tucked it against his chest. She dressed him in the warm clothes she had laid out earlier, an act that had looked to the household staff like normal evening preparation, a mother dressing her son warmly because the nights had turned cold. She had been dressing her exits in layers of ordinary acts for 8 months. She was very good at it now. They went down the back stairs, a route she had walked a dozen times in the preceding weeks, memorizing the sounds, the boards that gave underfoot, the angle of the security camera at the back landing that she had confirmed twice showed a blind spot on its eastern coverage. She had not disabled anything. Disabling things left traces. She had simply identified the gaps. The service road was dark. Diane's car sat with its lights off, engine running. Serena put Noah in the back seat, buckled him, gave him the rabbit, and got in beside him. Diane pulled away before Serena had closed the door. The estate disappeared in the rear window. Serena watched it go and felt nothing she would have predicted. Not relief, not triumph, not grief. What she felt was the particular aliveness of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally allowed themselves to exhale. Her phone, the burner, showed a text from Pele. 10 minutes out from the secondary terminal. All confirmed. She typed back, en route. Noah was already half asleep against her shoulder. She put her arm around him and looked at the dark road ahead, and let herself, for the first time in 8 months, think past the next hour. Lisbon. A rented apartment in Alfama that she had arranged through a shell company of her own construction. Something Claudette had helped her set up, clean and legal and traceable to nothing connected to her current life. A position at a financial consulting firm she had interviewed for remotely 3 months ago under a provisional identity that would become fully legal once she reestablished residency. A school for Noah, a neighborhood where nobody knew the name Vescari. A life that she had been building in secret with the same precision and patience she had spent 6 years watching Dante apply to things that would eventually destroy him. She was 32 years old, and she was starting over. And somewhere behind her in the lit-up estate, a Thanksgiving dinner was winding down, and her husband was accepting the premise that her okay had meant submission, and somewhere in her encrypted servers a package sat with a 72-hour clock ticking quietly, and somewhere in Vancouver her sister was waiting for a call that would confirm she had landed. The private terminal was small and cold and nearly empty. Pele was a heavy-set man with close-cut gray hair she'd noticed at their first meeting, the air of someone who had seen more complicated situations than this one and had not found them interesting. He nodded when he saw her, took her bag without being asked, led them to a small waiting lounge while the plane was prepared. Noah walked beside her holding the rabbit, looking at everything with his serious 4-year-old attention. "Is it a big plane?" he asked. "Medium," she said. "How many seats?" 12. He seemed to find this satisfactory and stopped asking questions. She sat down in one of the plastic chairs and pulled him onto her lap and felt his solid, small weight, and thought about the financial document she had found 14 months ago that had first made her stop and look twice. A single discrepancy. A transfer of $800,000 routed through a holding company in the Cayman Islands that, when she'd traced it back, connected to a real estate investment in Miami that had been liquidated at a 40% loss. The kind of loss that happened. The kind of loss that made sense in a bad market. Except that there had been no bad market the year the transfer occurred, and the investment itself, when she traced it through 2 more layers of corporate structure, appeared to be a property that did not exist. $800,000 into a property that did not exist, routed through a shell that technically had no beneficial owner on record, connected to a Vescari family account through 2 degrees of separation that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking and were transparently obvious to anyone who was. She had been looking. The next 6 months had been the most precise, most frightening, most clarifying work she had ever done. She was good at financial analysis. She had been good at it before Dante, before the marriage, before the estate, before the years of making herself smaller and quieter and less inconvenient. She had a master's in financial forensics from Penn and 4 years at a firm that specialized in complex corporate fraud before a life event she still thought of simply as Dante had redirected everything. Sitting in that study at 2 a.m. with 3 databases open, she had felt, underneath the fear, something unexpected. The very specific pleasure of being very good at something and finally using it. By month 3, she had documented 11 separate fraudulent transactions totaling over $14 million. By month 5, she had reconstructed enough of the shell company architecture to understand that Dante's empire was not merely engaged in the expected illegalities of its world, the cash movements, the regulatory evasions, the things that powerful criminal organizations do to maintain themselves, but was, beneath the surface, functionally insolvent. The legitimate businesses were real, but they were bleeding. The criminal enterprises were lucrative, but the cash was not going where it should be going. It was going somewhere else, through mechanisms so layered and complex that she had needed 2 weeks just to map them. And when she had finished mapping them, when she had looked at the full architecture of where the money was moving and why, she had sat back in her chair and understood that the mechanism had not been built by Dante. It had been built for Dante, built around him, built in a way that protected someone else's exposure at the cost of his. Alessio's fingerprints were on the original structures, the earliest shell companies, the foundational account architecture, the first property that didn't exist. Dante had inherited a system that had been designed from its inception to eventually fail in a way that pointed at him. She did not know if he understood this. She did not know if Alessio was still actively directing it, or if the old man had simply set it in motion years ago and watched it run. What she knew was that when it finally collapsed, and it would collapse, she had done the math on the runway, and the numbers were unambiguous. Dante would be the one standing in the rubble. She had held that knowledge for 2 months before she decided what to do with it. She was not going to save him. That had been a thought she'd had, briefly. The information she had was potentially exculpatory in certain framings, potentially a tool she could use to negotiate, to show him what she knew and offer him a way to restructure before the collapse. She had sat with that thought for exactly 1 week before recognizing it for what it was, the last version of the old pattern. The one where she found a way to make her knowledge useful to him, to fold herself back into the architecture of his needs, to trade her intelligence for his consideration. 6 years of Thanksgiving dinners, 6 years of Valentina's warmth with an edge, 6 years of being managed, corrected, contained. No, she was not going to save him. She was going to document everything, protect herself and her son, and leave. And if the collapse came in a way that legal authorities found interesting, and they would, because she had quietly, carefully made sure they would, that was not her doing. That was physics. That was what happened when structures built on false foundations ran out of runway. She had not felt guilty about this reasoning. That surprised her too. But the plane was a small citation, seats for 12, flight crew of 2. The pilot, a compact woman in her 40s with an Irish accent and the kind of eyes that looked at instruments instead of passengers, came back to introduce herself professionally and departed again. Pele had already transferred the luggage. Noah climbed into a window seat with the rabbit and pressed his face to the glass to look at the dark tarmac. Serena sat beside him and pulled out her personal phone, her real phone, the one Dante could see, and sent him a text. Checking on Noah? Be down soon. She had sent versions of this text before at large gatherings, always true, establishing a pattern. The text would show her as present, attentive, attending to their son while he managed the guests. He would not think twice about it. He never thought twice about her. Then she put her personal phone in her jacket pocket. She would leave it at the terminal, in the car with Diane, who would drive it back toward the estate and park it somewhere in the neighborhood, where it would eventually be found, a detail that would complicate the early timeline of her disappearance. And she took the burner phone and opened a draft she had been composing for 4 days. The email was addressed to Valentina Viscari. She had thought for a long time about whether Valentina was the right recipient. The obvious choice was Dante, but sending the initial package to Dante would be sending it into a controlled environment where lawyers and fixers could potentially contain it before it moved anywhere that mattered. Dante had resources. He would use them. Sending it to Valentina was sending it to someone who had spent decades believing in the absolute solidity of what her husband and son had built. Someone who, upon receiving evidence that the architecture of her entire life had been constructed on fraud and concealment, would not be capable of containing her response long enough for the lawyers to manage it. Valentina would react. Valentina would make calls. Valentina would, in her fury and her wounded pride and her genuine, specific outrage at having been deceived by the men she trusted most, do more damage to the Viscari Empire's carefully managed narrative in the first 48 hours than Serena could do in a year. The email was 12 sentences. It attached the Thanksgiving recording, 63 minutes of audio from a device no larger than a coat button, capturing Valentina's voice asking for an apology, Dante's quiet threat, the specific conversation about the offshore accounts, and a 48-page document summary of the financial evidence with links to the encrypted server where the full files resided. The subject line read, "What Dante and Alessio didn't tell you." Serena's thumb hovered over the send button for approximately 4 seconds. She was aware that this was the moment. Not the packing, not the boarding, not the quiet okay at the dinner table. This was the moment after which everything was irrevocable. She pressed send. The email left. The engines spooled up. Noah turned from the window with his rabbit and leaned against her arm, and she let him, and she did not look at the phone again. At 35,000 feet, somewhere over the dark middle of the Atlantic, Serena Ashcroft sat in a leather seat in a small plane with her sleeping son against her shoulder and thought about the first time she had met Dante Viscari. A charity auction. 8 years ago. She had been 24, working the event as a junior analyst for the firm that had organized the financial compliance component of the fundraiser, wearing a dress she'd borrowed from a colleague because she hadn't owned anything suitable. He had come across the room toward her with the particular confidence of a man who had never in his life needed to recalibrate his approach, and he had said something ordinary. She genuinely could not remember what, some comment about the auction catalog, and she had felt the weight of his attention like weather. She understood now that the weight of his attention had been the thing. That quality of focus, of being seen by someone who seemed to see very few people. She had mistaken it, at 24, for intimacy. It was not intimacy. It was assessment. He had assessed her and found her useful, and she had walked into a life she'd spent 6 years slowly understanding was not built for her to exist inside as a full person. She was not angry anymore. She had been angry, deeply and specifically angry, for months during the investigation. Angry at Dante, angry at Valentina, angry at herself for the years she had spent making herself smaller. But sitting here now, at 35,000 feet, with the package sent and the clocks running, the anger had burned down to something cleaner and less sentimental. She had done what she had needed to do. She had protected her son. She had used the skills she had and the patience she had developed, and she had built a way out from inside a situation that was designed to have no exits. Noah made a small sound in his sleep. She adjusted her arm around him. Her phone, the burner, showed a message from Claudette. Package received. Clock started. Everything in order. And then, 60 seconds later, a second message. Valentina opened the email 9 minutes after you sent it. Serena looked at this for a moment. Then she put the phone away and closed her eyes. Below her, back in a city that would begin to feel the reverberations by morning, a woman in charcoal silk was reading an email in a house where 40 people were still finishing their dessert. A patriarch with moving eyes was pouring himself a second glass of wine, and a man who had ruled through the quiet engine behind his eyes was accepting the premise that his wife had submitted, that the word okay had meant what it always meant, that nothing had changed. By the time Dante Viscari understood what had actually happened in that dining room, Serena would be in Lisbon. By the time his lawyers finished reading the 48-page document summary, the federal investigators would already have copies. And by the time the Viscari Empire fully understood the nature of the instrument that had been used to dismantle it, not a weapon, not a betrayal in any traditional sense, but 8 months of meticulous, patient, forensically precise truth, Serena Ashcroft would be watching her son play in morning light on a street in Alfama, and she would be, for the first time in 6 years, exactly where she was supposed to be. But that was not yet. That was still ahead. What was happening now? What was beginning now, in the minutes after the email arrived and before the full machinery of consequence had started moving, was something that Serena could not yet see from 35,000 feet. Something that would arrive in the morning when Valentina Viscari made her first phone call. When Alessio Viscari understood that the email had come from within the family. When Dante pulled up the flight records and saw a citation departing from the private terminal at 11:47 p.m. on Thanksgiving night, and understood for the first time what the word okay had actually meant. She had planned for what came next. She had planned carefully and thoroughly, and with a forensic attention to contingency that she was proud of. She had not planned for what Dante would do when he finally understood that she had been 3 moves ahead of him for 8 months. That was the thing about men who ruled through the weight of their attention. They were very good at making decisions quickly under pressure. And Dante Viscari, for all his failures and his concealed collapses and his inherited architecture of fraud, was still, in the cold mechanics of crisis, extraordinarily good at making decisions. The plane flew east, the clock ran, and back on the ground in a house in a city that was about to wake up to a very different world, a phone began to ring. The phone rang at 12:14 a.m. Dante heard it from the far end of the main hall, where he had been standing with a glass of bourbon he hadn't drunk, talking to Ricci, his head of operations, a man built like a door and twice as useful, about a logistics problem in the northern distribution chain that had been unresolved for 3 weeks. The ringtone was his mother's. He excused himself without hurry, because hurry was not something Dante Viscari did in front of other people, and walked toward the study with the phone against his ear. "It's late," he said. "Where is she?" Not a question. Valentina's voice was a register he had heard maybe 4 times in his life, stripped of its usual warmth, stripped of the performance, down to something that sounded like structural material under extreme load. He stopped walking. "She went to check on Noah." 2 hours ago?" He said nothing. "Dante." A sound on the line, not quite a breath, something tighter. "I need you to check her room, right now, while I'm on the phone." He was already moving. He took the stairs without rushing and pushed open the door to the master suite and stood in the doorway and looked at what was there, which was the room, undisturbed, the bed made with the precision the household staff maintained, the closet door standing open. He crossed to the closet. He stood in front of it for 3 seconds. "Her suitcases are gone," he said. Silence on the line. Then, "Check the boy's room." He already knew what he would find. He walked down the hall anyway. The room was made up. The stuffed rabbit, that battered gray thing Noah carried everywhere, was gone. The small backpack that usually sat on the hook beside the door was gone. Tess, the babysitter, had taken the night off, which he had noticed and not thought twice about. He thought about it now. "She's gone," he said. "I know she's gone." Valentina's voice was very controlled now, in the way that very controlled things are when they are extremely close to losing control. "She sent me an email." "When?" 40 minutes ago. "Dante, I need you to sit down and listen to me very carefully before you do anything." "I'm not going to sit down." "Then stand and listen." A pause. He could hear her breathing. "She sent me a recording of tonight at the table." Another pause. "And other things, documents. I don't fully understand all of it, but there is an attorney's name on the cover page, and the attorney is Claudette Marsh, and I know that name, Dante. I know exactly who that name is." He stood in his son's empty room with the light on and looked at the bare hook where the backpack had been. The bourbon he'd left downstairs. Ricci's still in the hall, probably. 40 people who had been in this house tonight, half of whom were still here. "Forward me the email," he said. "I will forward you the email, and then you're going to call me back and explain to me what I am reading. All of it, because there are things in this document." Her voice broke, just slightly, just at the edge, and then reassembled. "There are things in this document about your father." The room was quiet. "Forward it," Dante said. Ciao. He read it in the study with the door locked. Ricci knocked twice, and he said nothing both times, and eventually Ricci stopped knocking. The 48-page document loaded on his laptop, and he read it the way he read all difficult things, forward, methodically, without backtracking, because backtracking was a form of hoping you had misread something, and he had learned a long time ago that hoping you had misread something was a waste of time you did not have. He read for 40 minutes. When he finished, he sat back in the leather chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The bourbon was on the desk. He had not touched it. His phone showed 6 missed calls, 4 from numbers he recognized as belonging to people who had been in this house tonight and had apparently already received some version of whatever was moving through the network. He did not return the calls. He called one number. It rang twice. His father answered on the second ring, which meant Alessio was awake, which meant someone had already called him, which told Dante something important about the speed at which this was moving. "You've read it," Alessio said. Not a question. "Where did she get the Luxembourg transfers?" Dante's voice was very flat. A pause, longer than it should have been. "I don't know yet." That's not what I asked. Dante? The Luxembourg transfers, the Cayman structure, the property in Miami. She has the full chain. She has the beneficial ownership documentation. She has the original transfer authorizations. Some of those authorizations have your signature on them. He stopped. Not a facsimile, not a proxy. Your signature. Silence on the line. Those accounts were supposed to be sealed, Alessio said finally. They were sealed. Dante's hand was on the desk, flat, pressing into the surface. She unsealed them. She's been doing this for months, and I didn't know, and you didn't know, and now she is on a plane somewhere, and she has sent this to my mother, and her attorney has already filed preliminary injunctions on 3 of the operational accounts. I just got the notification. It came in while I was reading. So I need you to tell me, right now, what else is in those structures that she might have found. Another pause. This one felt different, heavier. Come to the house, Alessio said. Tell me on the phone. Come to the house, Dante. This is not a phone conversation. Everything is a phone conversation right now because my wife is somewhere over the Atlantic with 8 months of our financial records, and I need to know the full scope before I can come to the house. The voice was not raised. It was very final. There are things you don't know. I will tell you what you need to know. Come to the house and we will manage this. Dante looked at his phone for a moment after the call ended. The screen showed the time, 1:47 a.m. Somewhere over the Atlantic, she'd had a 3-hour head start minimum, probably more. The private terminal near the estate served 2 charter companies, and he had already sent a message to the contact who monitored those manifests. The message had not yet been returned. He sent a second message. He put the phone down. He opened the document again and went to page 31, where the analysis of the Luxembourg chain was laid out in the particular clean, annotated style of someone who knew exactly what they were building and had built it to be read by people who adjudicated financial crime for a living. He read 3 pages. He closed the laptop. He picked up his bourbon and drank it and put the glass down and sat in the locked study of his own estate and understood that his wife was considerably smarter than he had ever taken the trouble to find out. Valentina arrived at Alessio's house before Dante did. She had driven herself, which she never did. Her driver had been asleep, and she had not woken him, had taken the keys from the hook in the garage and driven the 40 minutes to Alessio's property in the hills with both hands tight on the wheel and the heat off and the windows up, a specific kind of cold fury that required no comfort. She had been married to Alessio Vescari for 41 years. She had raised his son in the image of everything he said the family stood for. She had endured the things that were required to be endured and performed the things that were required to be performed, and she had believed this was the part that sat in her chest like a piece of glass. She had genuinely believed that whatever was hidden from the outside, not from her, not from his wife. Alessio opened the door before she knocked. He was dressed, which meant he had been awake, which meant the call had already reached him, which meant the call had come from somewhere other than Dante, someone else in the network, someone who had already seen the document or the email or whatever was moving through the family's channels tonight. He looked at her and she looked at him, and 41 years of marriage passed between them in the specific way that only marriages recognize. A shorthand of surface and depth, of what is said and what is understood beneath it. "Come in," he said. She walked past him into the hall. She did not sit in the living room. She stood in the center of the kitchen, which was the room they had always actually talked in, the formal room's a performance for the outside, and she set her bag on the counter and she said, "Tell me what's in the document." "Valentina, don't." Her voice was flat and clear. She was 63 years old, and she had not cried in front of another person since her mother's funeral, and she was not going to start tonight. "I read the summary. I don't understand all of the financial structure, but I understand the names and the dates, and I know what a forged authorization looks like when someone takes the trouble to tell me what I'm looking at." She looked at him steadily. "Your name is on the original Cayman structure. The name on that structure is... I know whose name is on it technically. I've read 48 pages of analysis written by someone who clearly has a forensics degree and 48 pages of patience. And I understand enough of it to know that technically and actually are being kept very carefully separate in that document. And I want to know what actually means." She put her hands on the counter. "I want to know what you built. I want to know what you built and put Dante's name on, and I want to know why. The kitchen was very still. The clock on the wall, a ceramic thing they had bought in Florence on their 25th anniversary, Valentina had loved it once, made its small mechanical sound. Alessio sat down at the kitchen table. He was 71 years old, and he looked it right now, in a way he didn't always look it. The age coming through the posture, the specific weight of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has been located. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not going to sit down. The structures were built to protect the family," he said. "When I built them, the family was in a different position. We had exposure on the Eastern accounts that I don't want the explanation of why you built it. I want to know what it is." A pause. He looked at his hands. "It's a liability architecture. The beneficial ownership structures route the exposure through Dante's signature companies rather than through the original accounts, which are..." He stopped. "The original accounts connect to things that predate Dante's involvement, things from before. If the structures are investigated from Dante's end, the exposure stops at Dante. The original accounts remain protected." The ceramic clock made its sound. Valentina said very quietly, "You built your son a trap." "I built the family a firewall." "You built your son a trap, and you let him run an empire for 20 years without telling him that if it ever fell apart, the fall would land entirely on him." Her voice had no volume now. Volume would have been easier. This was something else. "He doesn't know. He knows the general structure at... He does not know." She looked at her husband. "I have known Dante for 40 years. I know what he looks like when he understands something fully, and I know what he looks like when he has been managed. You managed him. For 20 years. You put him in a system designed to fail in his name, and you told him he was running the empire." She straightened up from the counter. And a woman he underestimated for 6 years figured it out and documented all of it, and tonight she mailed me the evidence because she knew I would be more dangerous with it than anyone else you could possibly try to contain. Alessio said nothing. "She was right," Valentina said. Dante arrived 40 minutes later. He walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw his mother's face and understood that the conversation that had happened before he arrived had moved things to a place that couldn't be walked back. His father was still at the kitchen table. His mother was standing by the window with her arms crossed, and she did not turn when he came in. "She has the Luxembourg chain," Dante said to his father. "I need to know the full scope." "Sit down," Alessio said. "I don't..." "Dante," his mother's voice from the window, still not turning. "Sit down and let him tell you. You need to hear it." He sat, and Alessio told him. It took 23 minutes. Dante sat with his hands flat on the table and did not interrupt except twice, once to ask a number, which Alessio provided, and once to ask a date, which Alessio also provided. When Alessio finished, the kitchen was quiet again. "How long?" Dante said. "The original structure was built before you took over operations, 18, 19 years ago. And you never told me. You didn't need to know. The structure was designed to... You never told me." Not louder. Not anything except a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Heavier, with something under it that might have been grief and might have been something considerably less forgiving. "I have been signing documents for 20 years that were routed through structures I didn't understand because you never told me what they were built on. I have run this family for 20 years thinking I understood what I was running." He stopped. "And Serena found it. Serena found the surface of it. The full structure is..." "She found enough." He looked at his father. "She found enough to give to a federal prosecutor before I had time to file a single protective motion. She sent it to my mother instead of to me specifically because she knew my mother would make calls I couldn't stop before I even knew the email had been sent." He stood up. "Where did she get the original authorizations?" Alessio was quiet for a moment. "There's a set of physical documents. In the estate archive. 3rd floor, the old records room. They should have been secured. She had access to the estate for 6 years." Dante stood with his hands at his sides. "She had access to every room in that house. You told me she was not a concern. You told me she was manageable." He looked at his father with something that was not quite an expression. "You were wrong." He walked out of the kitchen. His mother still hadn't turned from the window. He stopped in the doorway. "She took Noah," he said. Valentina said nothing. He's 4 years old and she took him out of his bed on Thanksgiving night and put him on a plane. Yes, his mother said. You're not going to say anything. A pause. What would you like me to say, Dante? He left. Mom. By 6 a.m., the legal team had been assembled via conference call across 3 time zones. By 7 a.m., the preliminary injunctions Claudette Marsh had filed were being reviewed by 2 of the family's attorneys, and neither of them had said anything reassuring. By 8 a.m., the contact at the private terminal had returned Dante's message with a confirmation. A citation had departed at 11:47 p.m. bound for Lisbon, party of 2 adults and 1 child. Manifest filed under names that were not Serena's legal name, but matched a shell identity his team had now traced back 3 months to a company and corporation that itself traced back to a law firm whose founding partner was Claudette Marsh. Dante sat in the study with this information and understood the shape of what had been built against him. Not against him specifically. Against the situation. Against the possibility that the situation might go wrong. Serena had not built a weapon aimed at him. She had built an exit. A total, comprehensive, forensically supported exit with a 72-hour failsafe and a legal team already in motion and a jurisdiction that was going to take months to even begin to establish reciprocal cooperation with. She had been planning this, he now understood, for the better part of a year, while attending his family's dinners, while sitting in his estate, while saying yes, and of course, and I understand, and finally, on Thanksgiving night, okay. He thought about the moment at the table, her face. The complete stillness of her face. His phone rang. Ricci, the federal task force that covers financial crimes in this district, made 3 calls to the Viscari Group's registered attorney this morning, Ricci said without preamble. The task force is out of the Southern District. They don't make courtesy calls, boss. They make those calls when they already have enough, and they're letting the attorney know it's coming. I know. This isn't a leak situation. This is structured disclosure. Whoever gave them this material gave them a package. This isn't someone talking. This is documents, chains, analysis. A pause. This is months of work. I know, Dante said again. Do you want me to find out where she is? The question sat in the air of the study. Outside the window, the morning was gray, the first light flat and cold over the grounds of the estate. Somewhere in the east wing, the household staff would be beginning the day. The table from last night would have been cleared, the turkey would be gone, the chairs would be set back in their places. She has a 72-hour failsafe, Dante said. Anything happens to her, the full package releases automatically. A beat of silence. How do you know that? Because that's what I would build, Dante said. He put the phone down. He sat with the gray morning outside the window and the locked study around him, and the full weight of 20 years running an empire that had been built from its foundation on a structure he had never been fully told about. And somewhere 35,000 feet up, or already on the ground in a city across the ocean, his wife was beginning a life she had constructed while sitting inside the one he had given her. Built in the gaps he had left when he looked at her and saw something manageable. The door to the study was locked. He did not unlock it. He picked up the 48-page document and started reading it again from the beginning, this time taking notes. Because the only way out of a structure this comprehensive was to understand it more completely than the person who had built the case against it. And the person who had built the case against it had 8 months and a forensics degree and had apparently been considerably more present in this marriage than he had ever. He had been reading for 3 hours when he found it. Not in the 48 pages Serena had sent. In the archive. He had gone to the 3rd floor records room at 9 in the morning with a flashlight and a specific intention. To find the physical documents Alessio had referenced, the original authorization set, to understand the full chain before the legal team's conference call at 11. The records room was what it had always been. Filing cabinets in rows, boxes stacked with the careful labeling of a household manager who had been doing this job for 30 years, the particular smell of paper and dry air that old records accumulate. Dante had been in this room twice in his adult life. He had never needed to come here because the records were managed, and the managing had always been sufficient. He went to the cabinet Alessio had indicated. 3rd row, 2nd cabinet, the section labeled with a date range that corresponded to the period before Dante had formally taken over operations. He opened the drawer. He found the folder. He pulled it and set it on the small table near the window and opened it under the flashlight. The authorization documents were there. 31 pages of original signatures, transfer instructions, beneficial ownership designations. He had seen copies of these in Serena's document analysis. Holding the physical originals was different in a way he couldn't articulate. There was a weight to them, a materiality, the specific reality of paper that had been touched by the people who had made these decisions. He read through them carefully. His father's signature appeared on 14 of the 31 pages, which was consistent with what Alessio had told him. His own signature appeared on 9 pages, which was consistent with what he already knew. Documents he had signed as part of routine operational transfers, presented to him in context that had made them appear to be something other than what they were. He turned to page 22. He stopped. He read the page again, then a third time. His hand holding the flashlight was very still. The signature on page 22 was not his father's. It was not his own. It was a signature he recognized from a different context entirely, from the operational side of the business, from the Eastern accounts, from a set of relationships that had nothing to do with the financial structures Alessio had described last night. The signature belonged to Marco Vieri. Marco Vieri had been Dante's most trusted operational lieutenant for 11 years. He ran the Northern Distribution Network, had oversight of 4 of the family's legitimate business fronts, and had been in the study with Dante just last night, had been the man Dante was talking to when his mother's call came in, the man he had excused himself from, the man who had stood in the hall and knocked twice on the study door and been turned away. Marco Vieri's signature was on page 22 of a document that Alessio had told him was a sealed internal authorization set that only Alessio himself had ever touched. Dante set the flashlight down on the table. He stood in the gray morning light of the records room and understood that the conversation he'd had with his father last night had been, like so many things in this architecture, a partial truth designed to direct his attention toward one thing so that he would not look at another. His father had told him about the liability structure. His father had explained the Cayman chain, the Luxembourg transfers, the beneficial ownership routing. His father had told him enough of the truth to seem cooperative, to seem like a man finally being honest under pressure. And Dante had sat at that kitchen table and received the information as revelation, and had not asked the one question that would have pulled the thread that mattered. Who else knew? He called Ricci from the records room. Ricci picked up on the first ring. "I need Marco's location," Dante said. A beat. "He's at the northern facility. He drove out this morning at... Don't tell him I'm coming." Another beat, this one longer, with a quality of attention in it that Ricci reserved for moments when he was recalibrating something. Understood. Dante put the documents back in the folder. He put the folder inside his jacket. He went downstairs, told the household manager he would be out until afternoon, and drove himself north in a car he chose specifically because it was not one Marco would recognize as his. The northern facility was a warehouse complex that served as the primary logistics hub for the distribution network. Legitimate on its surface, a regional supply chain company with 32 employees and contracts with 4 national retailers, and underneath that surface, a set of operations that the 32 employees were paid to be incurious about. Dante had not been to this facility in 8 months. He had trusted Marco to run it. He had trusted Marco to run a great many things. He parked 2 streets away and walked. The facility's side entrance used a keypad code he had not changed in 3 years. He entered it. The door opened. He went in through the loading bay, past a row of freight containers, toward the glass-fronted office at the back of the warehouse floor, where Marco typically worked when he was on site. Marco was at his desk. He was on the phone. Through the glass, Dante could see the posture of the call. Leaning forward, one hand on the desk, the particular focused stillness of a conversation that required attention. Dante watched him for a moment, reading the body language the way he had always read rooms, the way his father had taught him to read rooms before he understood the full scope of what his father had actually been teaching him. He opened the office door. Marco turned. The color did not drain from his face. Marco was better than that, had always been better than that. But something happened in his eyes, something that lasted less than a second, and was gone. And Dante had been watching eyes his whole life. "I'll call you back," Marco said into the phone, and ended the call without waiting for a response. He set the phone down. He looked at Dante. "I heard about last night. I was going to... Who were you on the phone with?" "One of the retail contracts. There's a delivery dispute." Who were you on the phone with, Marco? The office was small. There was a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out over the warehouse floor, where 2 workers were moving freight with a forklift. Dante had not sat down. He was standing 3 feet inside the doorway, and he had not moved, and he was not going to move until he had an answer that satisfied him, which he already knew was not going to happen, because the answer that would satisfy him was the answer Marco was not going to give voluntarily. Marco looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Claudette Marsh." The forklift moved on the warehouse floor. One of the workers laughed at something, the sound muffled through the glass. "Sit down, Dante." "You've been talking to Serena's attorney." "I've been talking to Serena," Marco said, "for 4 months." The room did not change. The light did not change. The forklift kept moving. Dante stood in the doorway and looked at the man he had trusted with the operational spine of his family's business for 11 years and let the full shape of what he was hearing assemble itself without rushing it, because rushing it would mean reacting before he understood, and understanding before reacting was the discipline that had kept him functional in situations that destroyed less careful men. "Tell me," he said. Marco leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has reached the point where the carrying is more exhausting than the putting down. "She came to me 7 months ago. She'd already found most of the financial structure on her own. She needed one thing she couldn't get from documents. She needed confirmation that the authorization set in the archive was physical, not digital. She needed to know the originals existed and where they were kept. And you told her." "I told her." No apology in his voice, no performance of regret, just the flat delivery of a man being precise. "I also told her about the Luxembourg chain, not the full structure. I didn't have the full structure, but enough to point her toward what she needed to find." "Why?" One word: flat. Marco looked at him. "Because Alessio offered me to the feds 3 years ago." The forklift stopped. One of the workers was talking to the other, gesturing at something on a shelf. Normal afternoon sounds in a warehouse, utterly disconnected from what was happening in the glass office. "Say that again," Dante said. 3 years ago, there was a federal investigation into the Eastern accounts. You knew about the investigation. You remember it. It was resolved. The attorneys managed it. What you weren't told was how it was resolved. Alessio made a proffer to the Southern District, confidential. He offered them a target, someone with enough operational knowledge to make the prosecution valuable, in exchange for the investigation closing. Marco's voice was even. "The target was me." Dante was very still. The deal fell apart because the prosecutor rotated out and the incoming prosecutor wasn't interested in the same trade. So nothing came of it. But I found out. 18 months later, through a source inside the district I've had for a long time, I found out what your father had offered, and to whom. He paused. "I've been in this family for 11 years, Dante. I've put 11 years into this. And your father put my name on a proffer agreement without telling you and without telling me and called it protecting the family." Outside the glass, the workers had gone back to work. The forklift started moving again. "So when Serena came to you," Dante said, "when Serena came to me, she was building a way out that didn't require anyone's permission and wasn't going to leave her or her kid in a situation where the collapse of the structure landed on them." Marco spread his hands on the desk, a gesture of simple logic. "I helped her because what she was building was also going to expose what Alessio did. All of it, including the proffer. Including the fact that your father was willing to hand me to federal prosecutors to protect accounts I didn't even have full access to." He looked at Dante directly. "I didn't do this to you. I did it to him." The distinction landed in the room and sat there. Dante recognized it as the kind of distinction that was simultaneously true and completely inadequate. True in its internal logic, inadequate in its practical consequences, which did not parse the difference between doing something to Alessio and doing it to the architecture Dante had been living inside. "You're the source in the document," Dante said. "The confirmation of the physical archive. That's what she used to establish that the originals existed and hadn't been destroyed. Without that confirmation, the documentation chain has a gap." "Yes." "And the federal task force. You spoke to them too." A pause. "Claudette Marsh spoke to them. I provided a supporting declaration, confidential, protected under her representation." He paused again. Dante, the investigation was going to happen regardless. The documents Serena built are sufficient on their own. I didn't add anything that changed the destination. I accelerated the timeline. By about a year, Dante said. By approximately a year. Marco said nothing. Dante took the folder out of his jacket. He set it on Marco's desk. He did not open it. He just set it there, the physical weight of it. 31 pages of original authorizations with Marco's signature on page 22. You signed the original beneficial ownership designation, Dante said. You're on the founding documents of the structure, which means you're not a witness in this investigation. You're a participant. He watched Marco's face. Does Marsh know that? Something moved across Marco's expression. Very brief. She knows I have exposure. She knows you have exposure, or she knows the specific document. A pause that lasted slightly too long. The specific document wasn't in the set Serena had access to. No, Dante said. It wasn't, because it's here in the physical archive, which Serena documented the existence of but didn't photograph directly. She only had the transfer records, not the authorization set. She knew the originals existed, but she didn't have images of every page. He looked at Marco steadily. Page 22 is the one page she doesn't have, and page 22 puts you inside the founding structure of the entire liability architecture, which means you're not a protected witness. You're a co-architect, and Marsh doesn't know it yet. The warehouse sounds came through the glass, normal afternoon sounds, the forklift, the workers, completely indifferent. Marco sat very still. Here's what is going to happen now, Dante said. His voice had not changed in register or volume across the entire conversation. It was the same quiet it always was. But there was something under it now that was different from the controlled engine Serena had spent 6 years trying to read. Something older, more stripped down. You are going to call Marsh. You are going to tell her that you need to discuss a material change in your evidentiary position. You are not going to tell her what the material change is until I have spoken to my own attorneys and we have established the exact shape of what is negotiable. And then you and I are going to have a different conversation about what the next 30 days look like. You're asking me to... I'm not asking. Dante picked the folder up from the desk and put it back inside his jacket. I'm telling you what keeps page 22 from becoming part of the public record before anyone has had a chance to manage it. For both of us. He looked at Marco one more time. You said you didn't do this to me. You did it to my father. I'm willing to operate on that distinction for the moment. Don't give me a reason to stop. He walked out of the office. He walked back through the warehouse, past the forklift, and the workers, and the freight containers, and the normal afternoon sounds of a logistics business, and out through the side entrance and back to the car he had parked 2 streets away. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment. He looked at the folder in his lap. Then he looked at his phone, which showed 3 more missed calls from the legal team and a text from Ricci that said only, Southern District made contact with our registered agent. Official. He had known this was coming. He had known it since he read the document at 2 in the morning. He had spent the hours since then calculating paths through the architecture. The legal paths. The operational paths. The paths that didn't exist but that he had examined anyway. Because the discipline of examining all paths, including the closed ones, was what had kept him functional for 20 years. The path he had not calculated was Marco. He had not calculated Marco because Marco had been inside his operational trust for 11 years, and inside operational trust, there is a category of person you do not examine too closely because the examination itself implies a suspicion you cannot afford to carry about someone you need to function. You trust the people you need to function. You do not interrogate them. That is the cost of trust, and also, he now understood, its liability. Serena had known this. She had understood that Marco was the gap, that the gap in any organization built on personal loyalty was the person the leader trusted enough not to watch. She had found Marco, and she had found his grievance, and she had used both with the same forensic precision she had used on everything else. He thought about her sitting across from Marco 7 months ago, what she had said, how she had presented the situation to make it legible to someone whose loyalty was already cracked. He did not know the specific words, but he understood the shape of the conversation she must have had. Clear, practical, precise, offering Marco a way to serve his own interests while believing he was making a principled choice. She had done the same thing he would have done. He started the car. His phone rang. Not Ricci. Not the legal team. A number he did not recognize, which was itself information, because people he did not recognize did not have this number. He answered, a voice he had never heard. Mr. Vescari, my name is Agent Patricia Cho. I'm calling from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division of the Southern District. I'd like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss some matters related to the Vescari Group's account structures. I want to be clear that at this stage you are not the subject of a criminal referral. You are a person of interest in an ongoing civil investigation. That distinction matters, and I want you to understand it before we proceed. A brief pause. I also want you to understand that we have been in contact with a representative of your father, Alessio Vescari, this morning, separately. I'm telling you that because I think you should know the conversations are happening in parallel, and you should have that information when you decide how you want to proceed. The street outside the car was very ordinary. A delivery truck, a woman walking a dog, leaves on the pavement from the night's wind. My attorney will be in contact with you within the hour, Dante said. Of course, Agent Cho said. One more thing, Mr. Vescari. The representative who contacted us this morning on your father's behalf indicated that Alessio Vescari is prepared to provide a full cooperation statement. I want you to have that information as well. The line went quiet, and Dante sat with it. Sat with the complete final shape of what his father had done, what his father was doing, the architecture that had been built around him for 20 years now completing its final function, the firewall doing exactly what a firewall is designed to do, which is contain the burn on one side so that the other side survives. Alessio was going to cooperate. Alessio was going to walk into the Southern District with his attorney and his 71 years and his reputation as a retired patriarch, and he was going to tell the federal investigators everything they needed to hear about Dante Vescari's operational role in the account structures. And he was going to do it before Dante's own attorneys had finished their first conference call. And the 20 years of documents with Dante's signature were going to become, in the hands of a cooperative witness, exactly the portrait of sole criminal responsibility that the liability architecture had been designed from the beginning to produce. His father had built him a trap, and his father was now, this morning, while Dante sat in a parked car on an ordinary street, closing it. He drove back to the estate and he drove fast. Not recklessly. Dante Vescari did not do things recklessly. Had never done things recklessly. Recklessness being the particular failure mode of men who confused urgency with panic, but with a focused, compressed velocity that came from understanding exactly how much time he had and exactly how little of it remained. The legal team's conference call had been at 11. It was now 10:43. He had 17 minutes to get ahead of whatever Alessio's attorney had already set in motion, and getting ahead of it meant making 2 calls before he walked into that conference room, and making those 2 calls meant understanding something he did not yet fully understand. He called his own attorney first, Hartwell, 64 years old, a former Southern District prosecutor himself, a man who had spent 30 years building a practice on the specific knowledge of how the Southern District thought and moved and prioritized. Hartwell picked up before the second ring. I know, Hartwell said. Alessio is cooperating. His attorney contacted the district at 8:15 this morning. We got word 40 minutes ago. A pause. I was going to lead with this on the call. What's the shape of it? Full proffer. He's offering operational testimony on the account structures going back 19 years. He's characterizing himself as a consultant who flagged concerns about the structures to you and was overruled. He's got documentation supporting that characterization. Internal memos, which I have to tell you, Dante, are going to be a problem because they were written in a way that he wrote them to himself, Dante said. A beat. You knew about the memos. I'm knowing about them right now. He wrote internal memos characterizing himself as raising concerns. Dated going back how far? The earliest one we've seen referenced is 14 years ago. 14 years. Dante had been running operations for 16. The memos would show a pattern of a cautious older advisor repeatedly flagging concerns to an aggressive younger operator who ignored them. The memos would be entirely fabricated in their intent and entirely authentic in their paper trail. His father had been writing them for 14 years. How do we respond? Dante said. We need to establish your own narrative of the account structures before the proffer is formalized. That means your own cooperation discussion with the district, which I have been strongly recommending for the past 2 hours and which you have not yet authorized me to. I'm authorizing it now. Silence on the line for exactly 1 second. All right, but not on Alessio's terms. Not a response to his narrative. We go in with our own package. Independent. And we go in today. Dante, assembling a cooperation package, and we have Serena's 48 pages. She did the work. We use it. He heard Hartwell begin to object and kept talking. The documentation she built is the most comprehensive financial forensic analysis of these structures that exists. It's already in the district's hands through her attorney. If we walk in with the same documentation and a cooperation posture that establishes my narrative first, that I was operating inside a structure I didn't fully understand, that the beneficial ownership architecture was not of my design, that there is a witness who can speak to the original construction of that architecture. Marco Vieri, Hartwell said. Marco Vieri is on the founding documents. He doesn't know we know that yet. He's currently operating under the assumption that his exposure is limited to his cooperation with Serena. When he understands the full scope of his position, he will need to make a choice about whose cooperation offer is more valuable to the district. A pause. Ours is more valuable. We have the physical originals. Marco is on page 22. Alessio's proffer doesn't mention Marco, because Alessio doesn't know Marco is on the documents, or if he knows, he doesn't know I know. Either way, Marco is the variable that changes the geometry of the whole thing. Mustn't. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. You're going to use the document Serena built to reframe your own liability. She built it to be used. She built it specifically to be read by people in the Southern District. I am in the Southern District's field of vision. I am going to make sure that when they read her document, they read it with my annotation. He turned on to the estate road. Call the district. Get us a meeting this afternoon. Not tomorrow. Today. I'll make the call, Hartwell said. The conference room in the estate's east wing held 8 people by the time he walked in at 11:02. 3 attorneys from the family's legal team, Ricci, the family's financial compliance officer, a quiet man named Strand who had been with them for 9 years, and who looked this morning like he had not slept, and 2 people Dante did not immediately recognize who turned out to be forensic accountants brought in by the legal team overnight. He sat down. He put the folder on the table. Alessio is cooperating with the Southern District, he said, without preamble. He has been since 8:15 this morning. He has a 14-year paper trail of internal memos positioning himself as a concerned advisor overruled by me. That is the narrative the district is currently receiving. He looked around the table. We are going to replace that narrative with a better one, and we are going to do it this afternoon. Here's what I need from each of you in the next 3 hours. He talked for 22 minutes. No one interrupted him. Strand took notes with a mechanical pencil and did not look up from the page. Ricci sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the particular expression he wore when he was processing something that required him to recalibrate everything he thought he understood about a situation. The forensic accountants asked 2 technical questions that Dante answered with sufficient precision that they exchanged a look he recognized as professional reassessment. When he finished, one of the attorneys, a younger man named Fitch, who had joined the firm 18 months ago and whom Dante had never fully evaluated, said, "What you're describing is essentially using your wife's case as the foundation of your own defense." Yes. The irony of that is, I'm aware of the irony, Fitch. Dante looked at him. The question is whether it works. Does it work? Fitch held his gaze for a moment. If Marco Vieri's page 22 exposure is as significant as you're characterizing, and if Alessio's proffer does not account for Marco's founding role in the structure, then yes. It creates a significant credibility problem for the proffer and opens a negotiating window for an alternative narrative. He paused. It works. Then that's the conversation. Dante stood. Hartwell is arranging the district meeting for this afternoon. Strand, I need the account flow analysis completed before we walk in. The forensic team works with you directly. Ricci. He looked at Ricci. Find Marco. Tell him I need him at the estate by 2 o'clock. Don't tell him why. If he asks, tell him it's about the Northern Facilities contract dispute. Ricci nodded once. And someone needs to call Valentina, Dante said. He said it flatly, without particular emphasis. She needs to be told that Alessio is cooperating with federal investigators in a way that implicates her son. She should not hear that from anyone other than me, but I'm not going to be available to make that call in the next 3 hours. Someone needs to hold it until I can do it myself. No one moved to volunteer. He hadn't expected them to. He walked out. Marco arrived at the estate at 2:15, 14 minutes late, which was information. Marco was never late, had built 11 years of operational reliability on a punctuality so consistent it had become invisible, and 14 minutes late on this specific afternoon meant 14 minutes of sitting somewhere deciding whether to come at all. He came in through the main entrance, which was also information. The main entrance was formal, visible, the entrance you used when you wanted to be seen arriving, when you wanted to establish a posture of normalcy. Marco walked into the main hall with his coat on and his hands at his sides, and looked at Dante across the marble floor with the particular look of a man who has decided, in the 14 additional minutes he took, exactly how he is going to play this. "Northern Contracts," Marco said. "Come in," Dante said. They went to the study. Dante closed the door. He did not sit, and he did not offer Marco a seat, and Marco remained standing, which was the correct instinct. Sitting would have conceded something, and Marco had not decided to concede anything yet. Dante put page 22 on the desk between them. He did not explain it. He watched Marco look at it. Marco's face did very little, a slight tightening around the eyes, a breath that was fractionally longer than his normal breathing. He looked at the document for approximately 4 seconds, and then looked up. "Where did you find it?" "In the archive, where Alessio told me the authorization set was kept." Dante watched him. "He told me because he wanted me to find the documents in the archive. He wanted me to see the authorization set as evidence of the structure he built. He did not mention that your signature was on one of the pages, which tells me either he doesn't know or he chose not to tell me because your signature on that page is more useful to him as a surprise than as something I could prepare for." He paused. "I'm inclined toward the second option. Marco looked at the document again. His jaw moved slightly. "What do you want?" "Alessio is cooperating with the Southern District this morning. Full proffer. He's positioning himself as the cautious advisor, me as the reckless operator. His paper trail goes back 14 years. Dante let that land. He did not offer you as a target this time. He offered me. But the proffer doesn't account for page 22, which means his cooperation narrative has a gap that becomes very significant when the district understands that the founding document of the entire liability architecture has a third signature on it that neither he nor I have mentioned. You want me to go in with you? I want you to make a choice, right now, in this room." Dante's voice was even, almost conversational. "You can go to Marsh and tell her about page 22 and let her figure out how to manage your exposure from the outside, which will take time you don't have because Alessio's proffer is moving fast. Or you can walk into the Southern District with me this afternoon as part of a coordinated cooperation package that establishes a different narrative, one in which the founding structure was built by Alessio and his operational network, and the people who ran operations under it, including both of us, were working within a system whose full architecture was deliberately concealed from us. That narrative requires me to admit I knew about the structure. You already admitted that this morning, in your own office, with a federal investigation actively in progress." Dante looked at him directly. "You are on page 22, Marco. You cannot unsign that document. Your only remaining question is whether you go into this as someone who cooperated with the investigation from within a position of partial knowledge, or as someone who obstructed it by concealing a material document." The study was very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the estate grounds, a groundskeeper was operating a leaf blower, a thin domestic sound, absurdly normal. "You're asking me to trust you," Marco said. The word trust carried something specific in his mouth, something that acknowledged the history of the last conversation they'd had, the weight of what he'd disclosed this morning in the warehouse office. "I'm asking you to trust the math," Dante said. "Trust is a different conversation for a different time. Right now, the math is simple. Alessio goes in first, his narrative sets. The district builds their case on his framework. Page 22 stays buried in a physical archive that Serena didn't photograph. And eventually someone else finds it, or Alessio uses it himself when he needs additional leverage. And at that point, your exposure is unmanaged, and I am already convicted. He paused. Or we go in together this afternoon and we control when and how page 22 enters the record. Marco looked at the document on the desk for a long time. The leaf blower outside. The ordinary afternoon sounds of a house that was coming apart at its foundations. 2 conditions, Marco said. Tell me. My cooperation statement is filed before Alessio's proffer is formalized. Not after. Before. Hartwell is working on the timing. It's possible. Make it certain. His eyes were flat and specific. And the second condition is that Noah's custody situation is not something you contest. Whatever Serena filed, whatever the court process produces, you don't fight it. The boy stays with her. The room was very still. Something moved through Dante's expression that was not quite readable. Not anger, not grief, not the controlled engine. Something older and less managed. He stood with it for a moment. That's not a condition you have the standing to make, he said. I'm making it anyway. Noah is my son. Noah is 4 years old and he grew up in this house and he learned to read the weather before he learned to read words. Marco's voice did not rise. I've watched that kid for 4 years. I've watched what this place does to children. You know what it does. You grew up in it. He held Dante's gaze. She got him out. Let him stay out. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not adversarial. Something raw. Something that lived below the architecture of the situation and could not be managed or annotated or used. Dante looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, if the legal process produces a custody determination, I won't appeal it. It was not what Marco had asked for. It was what Dante was capable of offering, and both of them understood the distinction. Marco picked up page 22 from the desk. He held it by the corner, looking at his own signature. Then he set it back down. Call Hartwell, he said. The meeting with the Southern District was at 4:30 p.m. in a federal building conference room that smelled of recycled air and old carpet and the specific institutional neutrality of rooms where consequential things happen without ceremony. Agent Patricia Cho was younger than her voice had suggested, early 40s, compact, with a legal pad in front of her and a recorder on the table, and the unhurried manner of someone who understood that time moved differently in this room than it did outside it. Hartwell sat beside Dante. Marco sat on Dante's other side with his own attorney, a woman named Reeves, who had been briefed in the car on the way over and had asked 3 very precise questions and then gone quiet. Strand and one of the forensic accountants were available by phone. Cho looked at Dante across the table. Mr. Viscari, thank you for coming in. She said it without irony and without warmth, just a fact. I understand you have a proactive disclosure you want to make. I do, Dante said. Before we begin, I want to inform you that we received a cooperation proffer from Alessio Vescari's attorney at 8:15 this morning. That proffer is currently under review. Your attorney has been made aware. I'm aware, Dante said. I also want to inform you that we received, through independent channels, a comprehensive financial forensic package that we've been reviewing since approximately 3 a.m. this morning. She looked at him steadily. I think you know what that package is. I do. Then let's start with what you want us to understand about the structures described in that package that we wouldn't understand from reading it without your context. She picked up her pen. Take your time. Dante looked at the recorder on the table, the recycled air, the institutional carpet, the window behind Cho that showed a slice of late afternoon sky, already going gray at the edges. He thought about Serena at 35,000 feet, her son asleep against her arm, the burner phone in her hand, the send button already pressed. 8 months of work landing in a room exactly like this one, exactly as she had intended it to land. She had built the foundation of this conversation. She had built it with forensic patience, and she had left spaces in it, specific gaps, specific absences, that she had known would need to be filled by people with more operational knowledge than she had, people who had reasons of their own to fill them. She had not planned to be in this room. She had planned for this room to exist without her in it. He understood, sitting across from Agent Cho in the recycled air, that the room had been shaped by his wife in her absence more completely than anything he had ever built with his presence. He had spent 20 years walking into rooms and understanding that he controlled them. He had walked into this room and understood, for the first time in 20 years, that he was sitting inside something someone else had constructed, and that the only move available to him was to be useful to the construction rather than resistant to it. He began to talk. He talked for 90 minutes. Cho asked questions that were precise and sequential and revealed, in their sequence, the specific gaps in the documentation that Serena's analysis had left, the operational context, the relationship between the account structures and the distribution network, the specific role of Marco's Eastern contacts in the original beneficial ownership architecture. Marco answered 4 questions directly when Cho addressed him. Hartwell interjected twice on matters of legal framing. Reeves interjected once. When it was over, Cho looked at her legal pad. She looked at the recorder. She looked at Dante. "I want to be clear about where this leaves things," she said. "We are going to need time to evaluate the consistency between your disclosure today, the independent forensic package we received, and the proffer currently on the table from Alessio Vescari's counsel. That evaluation will take time. During that period—" "I understand the period," Dante said. "During that period," she continued, without acknowledging the interruption, "I would strongly recommend that you and your counsel review the civil injunctions currently filed against the Vescari Group's operational accounts. Several of those injunctions are going to be sustained regardless of the outcome of the cooperation discussion. I want you to be prepared for that." Hartwell made a note. "There's one more thing," Cho said. She set her pen down. "The forensic package we received contains a fail-safe mechanism, a timed release to multiple parties if a reset code isn't entered on a 72-hour cycle. We are aware of this mechanism. I want you to understand that any action taken against the individual who controls that reset code would be treated as obstruction and would immediately and permanently end any cooperation discussion." She looked at him without expression. "I want to be very clear about that." "You're clear," Dante said. She nodded. "Then we'll be in touch." The meeting ended. They walked out into the hallway. Dante, Hartwell, Marco, Reeves, and the door closed behind them, and the institutional corridor stretched in both directions under fluorescent light, identical in both directions, going nowhere in particular. Marco said quietly, "It's done." "It started," Dante said. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize, a number that resolved, when he looked at it, into a format he associated with international routing. Lisbon prefix. The text contained 4 words and no punctuation. "Noah is safe here." He stood in the fluorescent corridor and looked at those 4 words for a long moment. Hartwell was saying something about the timeline for the injunction review. Marco and Reeves had moved a few steps away, a separate quiet conversation. The corridor hummed with its institutional indifference. He typed back 1 word. "Good." He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the closed door of the conference room and then at the corridor stretching away in both directions, and somewhere in the middle of that fluorescent. Nothing. He understood that the version of his life that had existed before Thanksgiving was not a version he was going to return to, not because it had been taken from him, not entirely, but because the foundations of it had been built on things that had never been true. And you cannot return to a structure after the ground beneath it has been fully surveyed. Hartwell touched his arm. "We need to talk about the injunctions before the close of business today. There's a hearing scheduled for—" "I know," Dante said. "Let's go." They walked down the corridor, their footsteps flat and even on the institutional floor. And behind them in the conference room, Agent Cho was still sitting at the table, reviewing her notes in the recycled air. And somewhere in Lisbon, the afternoon light was doing something specific to the streets of Alfama. And a 4-year-old boy with a battered gray rabbit was seeing it for the very first time. The injunction hearing was on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. Serena watched it on a live stream from a laptop set up on the kitchen table of the Alfama apartment, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and Noah eating toast at the other end of the table, carefully cutting it into triangles the way she had taught him, his rabbit propped against the salt shaker. The courtroom feed was grainy, and the audio had a half-second delay that made everything feel slightly unreal, which was appropriate, she thought, because watching the formal legal dissolution of the world you had spent 6 years inside was inherently a thing that resisted feeling fully real. Claudette Marsh appeared on screen, standing at the plaintiff's table with the particular stillness of a woman who had done this so many times that the courtroom had ceased to produce any physiological response in her. Serena had spoken to Claudette 4 times in the past 6 weeks. Brief, practical calls, status updates, the specific language of legal process that contained within it enormous human consequences in very compressed form. The injunctions were being sustained. The operational accounts were frozen. The civil case was proceeding on a timeline that Claudette described as favorable, by which she meant moving faster than the Viscari legal team had anticipated and slower than the press was reporting. The press had been reporting it for 5 weeks. Serena had stopped reading the coverage after the 3rd day, not because it was inaccurate, but because accuracy was not the same as useful. And reading about yourself in the past tense while you were still in the present tense of your own life produced a dissociation she didn't have the patience for. On screen, the judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, was speaking. The audio delay made her words arrive slightly after her mouth moved, a puppetry effect. Serena watched her hands as much as her face, the specific gesture of a judge who has read the documents and found them sufficient, the slight downward press of both palms that meant, "This is decided." Noah looked up from his toast. "What's that?" "A meeting," Serena said. He considered this. "Is it boring?" "Very." He returned to his toast. She returned to the screen. The injunctions were sustained in full. Every illegal financial obligation tied to her name was voided. The shell accounts she had been listed on as a signatory, the ones Dante had used to create the appearance of her complicity in structures she had never been fully informed about, a layer of the architecture she had found late in her investigation and that had cost her 3 weeks of sleepless reconstruction to fully document and disentangle, were formally separated from her legal identity. Claudette's expression on screen did not change when this was announced, which was its own form of satisfaction. Serena closed the laptop. She picked up her coffee. It was cold and she drank it anyway, standing at the window that looked out over the narrow street below, where a woman was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 buildings, and a cat was sitting on a doorstep watching the street with the absolute monarchical indifference of cats everywhere. 6 weeks. She had been in Lisbon for 6 weeks, and it felt, in the particular way that radical changes in context can feel, like both 6 weeks and 6 years simultaneously. The old life receding with an almost physical sensation, the new one still too recent to have the texture of the familiar. The apartment was 3 rooms and a kitchen with yellow walls and floors that creaked in 2 specific places she had memorized so she could move at night without waking Noah. The street below was narrow and cobbled and smelled in the mornings of bread from the bakery 2 doors down. Noah had started at a small international school 10 days ago and had come home the first day silent and watchful, and had come home the second day talking about a boy named Tomas who had a collection of rocks. She turned from the window and went to wash the coffee cup. The custody determination came 8 days after the injunction hearing. Claudette called at 7 in the morning, Lisbon time. Serena was already awake. She was always already awake. Sleep in these weeks coming in short, reliable stretches, rather than the long, continuous dark she had once taken for granted. Full physical custody, Claudette said. Primary legal custody with supervised visitation rights for Dante, contingent on the resolution of the criminal referral. The court voided the prenuptial provisions that would have complicated asset division given the fraud findings. A pause, which in Claudette's economy of communication was the equivalent of a longer statement. "It's clean, Serena." Serena sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was still dim, the early light coming through the curtains in thin lines. From down the hall, she could hear Noah making the small sounds of a child beginning to wake. A shift, a murmur, the creak of his bed. "The supervised visitation," she said. "Court-appointed supervisor, neutral location, video calls permitted without supervision. He has not contested the determination." Another pause. He replied to the filing through his attorney with a single statement. No counterfiling. The statement said, and I'm reading directly, "Mr. Viscari accepts the court's determination and will comply with all conditions of the custody arrangement without appeal." She had not expected the absence of a fight to feel the way it did. She had expected relief, and she felt relief. But underneath the relief was something more complicated. Not grief exactly, not for him, but something in the vicinity of grief for the version of the situation that could have been avoided if different choices had been made by different people at different points over the past 6 years. That was a useless feeling, and she recognized it as useless, and she let it sit for approximately 30 seconds, and then she let it go. "Thank you, Claudette," she said. "The financial settlement timeline is separate. That's going to take— I know the timeline. We've talked about the timeline." She looked at the lines of light on the floor. "I just needed the custody piece." "I know," Claudette said. "Call me when you're ready to discuss the asset division. There's no rush on my end." She put the phone down and sat in the dim room and listened to Noah fully wake. The specific sequence of sounds, the rabbit retrieved from wherever it had fallen in the night, the small footsteps, the door opening, his serious face appearing in the doorway of her room with his hair in the disarray of sleep. "Is it a school day?" he asked. "Yes." He considered this with the gravity of someone consulting an internal schedule. "Okay," he said, and went to find his clothes. She stayed on the edge of the bed for another moment. She thought about the word okay and what it had meant in a dining room 6 weeks ago, and what it meant in her son's mouth right now, and the distance between those two meanings, the full span of it, the width of a life being rebuilt from a single syllable. Then she got up and went to make breakfast. The criminal referral against Dante was filed 11 weeks after Thanksgiving. The referral against Alessio was filed 4 days later, despite the cooperation proffer, or partly because of it, because what Alessio had offered in cooperation had been, in Hartwell's later description to Dante, a narrative so carefully constructed to protect the patriarch's position that it had functioned less as cooperation and more as an attempt to use the cooperation process as a vehicle for managing his own exposure, which the Southern District had found, in Cho's precise language, insufficient. The proffer had collapsed. Alessio's attorney had spent 2 weeks attempting to renegotiate its terms. The renegotiation had not produced results. The referral had been filed. Dante learned this from Hartwell, who called him on a gray December morning in the city, where Dante had been living in an apartment, not the estate was under civil attachment, with the specific austerity of a man who has removed from his immediate environment everything that is not strictly necessary. The apartment was clean and functional and contained nothing decorative. He had been living this way for 5 weeks, and had not found it as difficult as he would have predicted, which told him something about the estate that he had preferred not to examine directly while he was living in it. "The referral is what we expected," Hartwell said. "Given your cooperation disclosure, the district has characterized your exposure as secondary to Alessio's founding role in the structures. You will face charges. I want to be clear about that. But the framing of those charges and the likely sentencing range is significantly different from what it would have been without the disclosure." "Marco," Dante said. Marco's cooperation was formalized yesterday. His page 22 exposure has been characterized as unwitting participation in a structure whose full nature he did not understand at the time of signing. The characterization is generous, and it was negotiated carefully. A pause. "He's going to be all right." Dante stood at the window of the apartment. Below, the street was doing its ordinary December things, people moving with their collars up, a delivery truck double-parked, the city going about its business with the complete indifference cities maintain toward the personal disasters of their inhabitants. "My father," he said. "He's going to fight it. His attorney has indicated they'll contest the referral on the grounds that the cooperation proffer was entered in good faith, and the district's rejection of it constitutes bad faith on their part. It's not a strong argument, but it will slow things down." "Tikom tsakam." A pause. "Dante, he offered you as the sole responsible party in a structure he designed. He wrote memos for 14 years. He made a proffer before you were even awake that morning. Whatever you're feeling about this—" "I'm not feeling anything about it that requires managing," Dante said. "I just needed to know his position." After the call, he stood at the window for a long time. He was thinking about a specific memory. Not Thanksgiving, not the dining room, nothing from the recent architecture of collapse. A memory from much earlier, from when he was perhaps 8 years old, sitting at a different table in a different house while his father talked about loyalty. The specific vocabulary of it. Honor, family, what was owed and to whom. He had absorbed that vocabulary completely, had organized his entire adult life around it, had managed and controlled and constructed on its foundation for 20 years without understanding that the man who had given him the vocabulary had never fully believed it applied to himself. He had spent 40 years being his father's son. He did not know yet what it meant to be only his own. He turned from the window and went back to work. Chab, Valentina called Serena on a Thursday in January. Serena was at her desk in the small second bedroom she had converted to a workspace, reviewing a due diligence report for her new employer, a legitimate international financial consulting firm whose Lisbon office she had joined 6 weeks in, remote work transitioning gradually to in-person as Noah's school schedule stabilized. She saw the name on the burner phone. She had given Valentina the number herself, through Claudette, 2 weeks after leaving, an act whose logic she had examined carefully and concluded was not sentiment but strategy, because maintaining a channel to Valentina was maintaining visibility into the Viscari family's response architecture, and visibility was still useful even from a distance. She answered, "I want to say something," Valentina said, without preamble, which was not like her. The woman who always began with warmth, who always performed the approach before the point. The absence of performance meant something. "All right," Serena said. "I have been sitting with this for 2 months. I have been sitting with all of it. What you did, and why you did it, and what it has cost, and what it has." A pause. A sound that might have been a breath controlled very carefully. "I am not going to tell you that I understand your choices. I don't fully understand them, and I am not going to pretend that I do. I am not going to tell you that you were right. I don't know what right looks like in a situation like this." Another pause. "But I want you to know that I know what was in that dining room that night. I know what I asked you to do and why I asked you to do it, and I know what it was in service of. And I am not the same person who asked you for that apology." The desk, the due diligence report on the screen, the yellow walls of the apartment, the sounds of the street below, the ordinary Thursday sounds of a city that had nothing to do with any of this. "Valentina," Serena said carefully, "what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that Alessio is going to fight the referral, and the fight is going to be ugly, and he is going to say things in the course of that fight that are designed to redirect attention, and some of those things are going to be about you." Her voice had the flatness of someone delivering information they have decided to deliver cleanly. "I have already spoken to Claudette Marsh. I have provided a statement, a voluntary statement, characterizing the events of Thanksgiving night as I witnessed them, and characterizing the nature of the household environment as I participated in creating it." A pause. "It is not a comfortable statement for me to have made. It is accurate." Serena said nothing for a moment. "Why?" "Because Noah is my grandson." The flatness cracked, just slightly, at the edges, closed again immediately. "Because whatever else has happened and whatever else is going to happen, he is 4 years old and he needs a mother who is protected and a life that is stable, and the only thing I can do that is useful from where I am standing is make sure the people who are going to try to use him as leverage understand that I am not available to help them do that." The street sounds below. The due diligence report. The rabbit on the shelf across the room where Noah had left it this morning. He was leaving it places now, no longer needing to carry it everywhere, which the school's child development advisor had mentioned to Serena as a positive sign, a loosening of the anxiety object, a child beginning to trust his environment enough to put down what he had been holding. "He talks about you," Serena said. It was true. Not often, not with any distress, just occasionally, the way children reference the pieces of their former landscape. Grandma had a clock with flowers on it. Grandma's house smelled like something. "He has good memories." A silence on the line that was different from the previous silences. "Tell him—" Valentina stopped, started again. "Tell him the clock is going to be in a different house soon. He can see it again someday if he wants to." "I'll tell him," Serena said. The call ended. Serena sat at her desk with the phone in her hand and looked at the due diligence report on her screen and understood that the thing she had sent into motion 6 weeks ago had moved through every life it touched in ways she had calculated and ways she had not, and that the ways she had not calculated were not failures of the plan, but simply the nature of truth when it finally moves through a system that has been built to contain it. It does not move cleanly. It does not spare the innocent. It finds the cracks in every structure and moves through all of them simultaneously, and what is left after it is moved through is not restored to what it was, but changed into something that at least has the quality of being real. She put the phone down and went back to work. In March, the first criminal charges were formally filed. Alessio Vescari was charged with 9 counts spanning financial fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction stemming from his attempt to use the cooperation process to manage rather than disclose his foundational role in the account structures. His attorney filed a motion to dismiss that was denied in April. The trial date was set for the following January. Dante was charged with 4 counts, significantly fewer, the district's filing making clear in its language that his cooperation disclosure had been treated as material to the determination of charges. Hartwell had negotiated the framing carefully. The charges were serious and the consequences real, and the process would take the better part of 2 years to fully resolve. And Dante had looked at this timeline and accepted it the way he accepted things now, without the management, without the controlled engine, with something that felt less like control and more like a man learning to stand in weather without trying to redirect it. Marco received a deferred prosecution agreement. His testimony in the cooperation process had been assessed as sufficiently material to the case against Alessio that the district had exercised its discretion in the way Hartwell had calculated it would. Marco had called Dante when the agreement was finalized. The call had been brief. Marco had said, "I know what I owe you." Dante had said, "Don't." And then they had been quiet for a moment on the line. 2 men who had known each other for 11 years standing on opposite sides of a divide that would not be fully crossed again. And the quiet had been the most honest thing they had said to each other in the entire history of their association. The estate was sold in April. The civil attachment was resolved through a negotiated settlement that stripped the majority of the Vescari group's assets to satisfy the fraud judgments. The legitimate businesses, several of which were genuinely profitable and genuinely clean, things Dante had built properly because he had, despite everything, been capable of building things properly, were separated from the tainted structures and most of them survived, reduced, diminished, but real. Dante moved into a smaller place on the east side of the city. He kept working. He did not disappear. He had expected in the worst of the early weeks that the collapse of the public architecture of his life would produce in him a collapse of private structure as well, that without the empire, without the rooms that responded to his presence, without the weight of being the man everyone waited for before they sat down, he would find nothing underneath. He had been wrong about this. What was underneath was not nothing. It was smaller than what had been above it and considerably less impressive, and it was his. He thought about Serena sometimes, not with the specific heat of the early weeks, the anger, the cold calculation of a man reading a document that had been built against him, but with something cooler and more complicated, the feeling of looking at a piece of work and understanding its quality even when the work has cost you something substantial. She had been in his house for 6 years. She had been, in all the ways he had needed her to be, present and compliant and contained. And in all those years, in the gaps of his attention, she had been doing the most precise and patient and technically accomplished thing he had ever seen done. He had never asked her about her work. In 6 years of marriage, he had never once sat down with her and asked about what she did, what she was good at, what she thought about when she thought about things that mattered to her. He had known she was intelligent. That had been part of the original assessment, the qualities he had cataloged when he first crossed that room toward her at the charity auction. Intelligent, contained, suitable. He had cataloged her and stopped looking. He did not know what to do with this understanding exactly. It was not the kind of understanding that resolved into action. It was the kind that simply lived in you, the particular weight of knowing something about yourself that cannot be undone, that becomes part of the material you are made of going forward, whether you want it to or not. He had a video call with Noah in April. Supervised, court-appointed, 30 minutes. Noah appeared on the screen in a room Dante didn't recognize. Yellow walls, a shelf with books, the rabbit visible in the background, and looked at the camera with the serious 4-year-old attention that Dante had always found slightly unreadable, and now found, with the specific clarity of a man who has had several months to sit with his failures, simply familiar. His own face, at that age, in photographs he had found in the estate archive. The same watching. "Hi," Noah said. "Hi," Dante said. "I have a friend named Tomas. He has rocks." "What kind of rocks?" Noah considered this with genuine effort. The shiny kind, and some regular ones, he paused. I have one he gave me. That's good, Dante said. They talked for 23 minutes. Noah did most of the talking, about the rocks, about the school, about a bakery near the apartment that made a specific pastry he described with the total sensory commitment of a child reporting something important. Dante listened and asked questions and did not try to be anything other than what he was, which was a man on a screen talking to his son across a significant distance. And the distance was real, and it was the consequence of real things. And it was also, he understood, not the entirety of what remained between them. At the end of the call, Noah said, "Are you coming to visit?" Dante looked at his son. "Not right now, but someday." Noah thought about this. "Okay," he said, with the flat, uncomplicated acceptance of a child who has learned that okay is a word that can mean many things depending on who says it and why, and who has learned this from his mother, and who said it now with something in his small face that was not resignation, but patience. A 4-year-old's patience, uncomplicated by resentment, just the simple willingness to wait for what comes next. Dante kept his face steady on the screen. He did not look away. "Okay," he said back. In May, on a morning that was warm enough to sit outside, Serena took Noah to a garden near the waterfront that they had found 3 weeks earlier and had been returning to on weekends. A public garden with a fountain and old trees and benches where elderly men played chess in the afternoons, and children ran on the paths with the complete physical abandon of children who feel safe. She sat on a bench and watched Noah run. He had his shoes off, which she had allowed because the path was smooth and the morning was warm, and sometimes you let the small things go because the small things going is itself a form of living. He ran in the specific way of healthy 4-year-olds, not toward anything, not away from anything, just running because the body is new and movement is its own reward. She had the International Consulting Report open on her tablet, but she was not looking at it. She was looking at her son. She thought about the Thanksgiving dining room the way she sometimes thought about it, not with dread or triumph, but with the specific clarity of a fixed point. A moment so precisely located in her memory that she could stand at it and look in both directions, back at the years that had preceded it, and forward at the months that had followed, and understand the shape of the full thing from that single moment at its hinge. She had said, okay, and the room had thought she was submitting, and she had been already 3 moves past submission, already in the middle of the exit she had built, already holding in her hand the tools she had spent 8 months constructing in the gaps of their attention. She had not been brave in that moment. Bravery was not the right word for it. Bravery implied a choice made against fear. What she had felt in that moment was the cold clarity of a woman who had already made her choices in the quiet, who was no longer in the process of deciding anything, who had simply arrived at the moment of execution. The fear had come earlier. The fear had been in the 8 months of 2 a.m. work sessions. The fear of being found out, of the documentation being discovered, of the moment when Dante's attention might turn fully toward her and see what she was doing rather than the version of her he had decided to see. That fear had been real and physical. The specific body fear of someone operating inside a dangerous environment without the ability to show any sign of the operation. She had lived with it for 8 months, and she had let it make her more careful rather than less. And she had come out the other side of it. She had come out the other side of it here. On a bench in a garden in Lisbon, in May, with warm sun and her son running barefoot on a smooth path and an international consulting report she would get to eventually. Noah ran back to her, breathing hard, his face flushed with the specific joy of a child who has spent himself fully in pure motion. He climbed onto the bench beside her and leaned against her arm the way he always leaned, and she put her arm around him and he smelled of sun and grass and the warm bread smell of a healthy child. "Can we come back next week?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and turned to watch the fountain with his serious eyes. After a moment, he leaned a little further into her side, his weight fully settled, the particular trust of a child who has decided that the ground beneath him is solid and has stopped checking. She did not pick up the tablet. She sat in the May sun with her son's weight against her and looked at the fountain and the old trees and the chess players in the distance and the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of a morning with nothing threatening in it, and she let it be exactly what it was, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was the thing she had crossed an ocean to find and had found, not with ceremony or dramatic arrival, but the way most real things arrive, quietly, On an ordinary morning, when you are not looking directly at them, the fountain ran. The children ran. The chess players moved their pieces in the unhurried afternoon rhythm of men with nowhere else to be. Serena Ashcroft sat in the sun and stayed.